This is PowerPoint Lecture 3.2, essentially on the Eisenhower administration, but it goes under the title of the 1950s. When we left the last PowerPoint lecture, 3.1, we left with Truman being largely discredited, perhaps unfairly for mismanagement of the Korean War. The United States failed to achieve a decisive victory in Korea. In addition, his economic policies were beginning to falter. He had a political conflict with Douglas MacArthur, who was the hero of the Second World War in the Pacific, and that didn't look well for him. Most notably, we had a split in the Democratic Party between the progressives, which largely were behind Truman, and what were known as the Dixiecrats, which were the Southern Democrats. So their power base split. And then we had the rise of a more popular Republican candidate in the form of Dwight David Eisenhower, who himself was the hero of the war in Europe against the Germans. And so we left with Truman leaving office. We also had the 22nd Amendment in there, which had been installed in 47 and prevented Truman from running for an additional term anyways. And so, but with Eisenhower, what we're going to see, and you see it says here, the rise of the modern Republican Party. Remember that the Republican Party, and this was one of the crippling things for them in the 48 election against Truman, one of the reasons they weren't able to gain enough traction against Truman in 48, they were still held accountable for the economic catastrophe that became the Great Depression. Okay, you had three Republican presidencies. You had Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, bam, 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 in a row in the 1920s, and that set up the precedent conditions for what became the Great Depression. And Hoover, to history, Hoover is thought of as not having done anything. We looked in class when we started the Great Depression that, in point of fact, that's not true. That's a little unfair. Hoover actually did attempt to implement something, but it was a little bit too little, too late. And so the Republicans were largely held accountable for this. It was a Democratic administration that was in office both during the Great Depression that brought back at least some hope, although the New Deal, as we looked at, faltered at a couple of points. And it was also a Democratic regime that was in the presidency, or Democratic administration that was in the presidency throughout the Second World War. So their popularity was still there. But because of the reversals of the Truman administration, particularly in Korea, and I also should make mention of the fact that Truman was held accountable for failing to defend the Republic of China during the Civil War with the Communists, with the People's Republic of China, with the Communists under Mao Zedong. So as a result of that, the Republican Party has an opportunity to rise up again, and it will do so in the guise of Dwight David Eisenhower, but it will be a reinvented Republican Party. Among other things, what we're going to see with the new Republican Party, and this will carry throughout, okay, is that the Republican Party will not be nearly as laissez-faire economics as they were in the 1920s. Okay, in the early part of this class, we looked at the Republican Party, and the Republican Party, one of the recurring themes through the Republican Party was laissez-faire economics, little government regulation, little intervention. That's going to change a little bit. Eisenhower will be less than Truman, but as we go through the years, we're going to have the Republican Party start to take on less of a laissez-faire character and do a little bit more government intervention. I mean, we'll have Richard Nixon imposing price controls, wage and price controls. That's hardly laissez-faire. And Reagan, for some reason, Reagan is to history thought of as this ultra-conservative Republican. Reagan raised government spending to an unprecedented peacetime level. Okay, but we'll deal with that when we get to the 80s. Okay, and so that's more or less what we have here. Is the rise of Eisenhower. And as I mentioned to you in the introductory video, and as we talked about a little in the lecture on the post-war, what we're going to see, one of the dominant trends here is going to be foreign policy. We looked at the Truman Doctrine, which called for the containment of the Soviet Union. Well, Eisenhower is going to launch a doctrine too, which we'll look at in just a second. The Eisenhower Doctrine was more active than the Truman Doctrine. The Eisenhower doctrine called for the active containment of the Soviet Union. Okay, and so it was a little more proactive. It won't be as proactive as Reagan, who the Reagan doctrine called for the rolling back of the Soviet influence, for actually reducing uh, Soviet influence. The Eisenhower doctrine will be a little bit more forceful, and as a result of that, what we'll see in the Eisenhower administration is a lot more interventions than we saw with Truman. We're going to actually see more interventions than we'll see with Johnson or Nixon or Carter or even Reagan. We're going to see repeated numbers of interventions by the Eisenhower administration in an attempt to stave off what Eisenhower's administration and what Eisenhower perceives as potential Soviet aggression. Okay? And so the Eisenhower doctrine is that the United States will assist anyone who opposes communism. This gives, in American foreign policy, this gives rise to what we refer to, the Eisenhower doctrine is sometimes referred to as the ABC doctrine. Okay, the ABC doctrine you see there is anything but communist. And as a result of that, the Eisenhower administration is going to end up backing a great number of military dictatorships, okay, which will ultimately not bring Eisenhower under pressure, but will bring the United States under pressure for the human rights violations of these. Okay, now we want to be careful here, because in the 1950s, when Eisenhower launches this doctrine, there is no idea of human rights. Human rights doesn't exist as a doctrine. That won't come in until the 70s and 80s, and by the time it does come in, the United States starts getting lambasted for supporting regimes like Somoza in Nicaragua or the Shah in Iran, which are documented for numerous violations of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Okay, so the Eisenhower administration is going to begin this trend, and it will continue all the way into the 90s, all the way into the present day, actually, of this support for pro-U.S. repressive authoritarian governments. Okay, and we'll take a look at that. We're also going to have Eisenhower. Now, remember, Eisenhower wins the 52 election and comes into office then. He'll actually make a trip to Korea. He'll be the only president actually to visit a war zone. He'll visit the war zone in Korea and commit himself to making sure that an armistice is signed. And he's come under fire for that. He's come under criticism for that over the years. It was felt that maybe he could have negotiated a little bit better armistice with North Korea and the Chinese, but Eisenhower was very interested in settling his differences with the People's Republic of China in Korea so that he could pay attention to what he perceived to be other Soviet threats in vital areas to U.S. interests, most notably Latin America and the Middle East. Okay? So he didn't want to be overextended. In 1953, as a result of secrets actually stolen from the United States, they actually stole the technology from the United States, the Soviets developed the hydrogen bomb. Now, there's a fundamental difference between the hydrogen bomb and the atomic bomb. The hydrogen bomb is not technically a nuclear bomb. It generally is thought of as such, but it functions on a very different principle. An atomic weapon, such as were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is based on fissile material. In other words, what you do is you split the atom, usually plutonium or uranium, whereas with hydrogen, a hydrogen bomb, you're actually fusing atoms together. You fuse hydrogen atoms together, and it creates an exponentially larger amount of energy. And so the bombs that fell on Hiroshima were approximately 5 to 10 kilotons, and Nagasaki the same. A hydrogen bomb, a kiloton is 1,000 tons of TNT. A hydrogen bomb is measured in megatons. Okay, the largest of them being generally about 50 megatons. That would be 50 million tons. And so the blast radius is much larger. It's a much more dangerous weapon. And so when the hydrogen bomb comes on board, it becomes a much more serious nuclear game or weapons of mass destruction game. Now, as a result of this, what's going to come out is deterrence theory. Now, deterrence theory had kind of existed all along. And just kind of real briefly, in international relations, we study deterrence theory a little bit more than we will here. We just want to touch on it as part of the U.S.-Soviet relationship, particularly from the 50s through the 80s. But there's a fundamental flaw in deterrence theory. Now, you see what deterrence theory is there. It's a threat of the imposition of unacceptable costs if the opponent engages in an unwanted action. Okay, so for example, if for example a wife threatens a husband with castration if the husband ever cheats on her, and I'm not going to tell you where I come up with that example, but okay, that's deterrence theory. Okay, a threat of an unacceptable cost if the opponent engages in an unwanted action. Okay, now the problem with it as a theory is it really doesn't constitute a theory in the same sense as a scientific theory because it can't actually be tested. You can't actually test whether or not it works. For it to work, it presupposes that the opponent wants to engage in the action. Okay, there's actually, and so when we deal with the U.S. and Soviet deterrence against one another, you have to try to find some evidence that the Soviet Union actually wanted to expand, and it's very sketchy evidence about that. But the deterrent threat was essentially, if you try to expand, we'll nuke you. When the Soviets developed the hydrogen bomb, this threat kind of changed, and it ushered in what's known as the balance of terror, because fairly rapidly, both sides in the conflict developed the capacity to eliminate all life on Earth. Because of the hydrogen bomb is much more extensive. And in the 60s, they developed the multiple independent reentry vehicle, which is the MIRV, where you could put multiple warheads on a single missile. And so this ushers in the age, the stratagem that is developed by Eisenhower. Eisenhower is the one that adopts this mutually assured destruction. Okay, both sides keep each other in check because of the knowledge that either side can annihilate the other one with nuclear weapons. Okay, and so it creates this mutually assured destruction. Simultaneously with this, actually just a few years later, the Russians will launch Sputnik. Now, Sputnik in and of itself is just a very small communications satellite, really fairly meaningless, not terribly effective. It falls out of the sky very quickly after it's launched. But the importance of it is the technology that was necessary to launch it into space. Now, it's kind of an interesting side game to the game between the U.S. and the Soviets. In the closing days of World War II, the United States and the Soviets raced into Germany and made off, essentially, with German scientists. Well, the United States the Soviets got the propulsion experts. That's why they got into space first. Okay, it was actually German scientists that developed the capacity to launch a satellite. The United States got the scientists that were targeting. Okay, and so U.S. weapons tended to be more accurate. Soviet weapons tend to be longer range and more defensive in nature. Okay, and so just kind of as a technical point of view, any nation that can launch a satellite into space can develop an intercontinental ballistic missile. Okay, it's the same technology. In fact, it's really the same vehicle. The same vehicle that carries a satellite into space can be used to carry a nuclear warhead to a target on Earth. Okay, and so that's the importance of the launching of Sputnik, is it enters in the race of the ICBM, and it creates the space race. Okay, and what we mean by the space race is there's now a race. If we think of it in strategic military terms, the advantage is always given to obtaining and holding the high ground. Well, there's no higher ground than space. And so there will be a movement towards developing space in general. This will be the formation of NASA, and ultimately the interest of the United States in landing on the moon, because the military applications of this are, I should think, relatively obvious. Now, what the race in nuclear technology and in conventional arms and in the space race is going to create is what is referred to as the military industrial complex. Okay? And what will be of great concern, really, for the next 30 years, is the balance between nuclear forces and conventional forces. If we look, for example, at the European theater, the United States, until really the mid 70s or early 70s, the United States has a superiority in nuclear armament, but the Soviets have the numbers advantage in conventional armament. Okay, and it gets us to. I make a little side note here of Richardson's arms race model because I always feel like I need to give Lewis Fry Richardson a plunk. Lewis Fry Richardson was the first person in the field of political science to develop a mathematical model. It used differential calculus. It's what turned me on to mathematical modeling. In my dissertation, I developed a mathematical model, or attempted to develop a mathematical model of the international system itself. Okay, um, and this was kind of inspired by Richardson, who I bumped into as a young undergraduate, wet behind the ears, out at Hiram College way back when. Uh, but Richardson's arms race model relates a number of variables together in a differential calculus model in an attempt to predict, for all intents and purposes, the victor in an arms race. And what he comes up with, the primary factors determining the victor are the ability to afford the race, fatigue, meaning wearing out the economy and wearing out the civilian population, and civilian resistance to the effort. Okay? Now, as a result of the development of this arms race, we're going to have the rise of the military-industrial complex. And you see there that I give a footnote to the basis of the Japanese Empire. If you remember our discussion of the rise of the Japanese Empire prior to World War II, really at the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, an alliance is forged between the industrialists and the militarists. Okay, so the Japanese form a military-industrial complex. Both the United States and the Soviet Union will do that as well. The difference being that largely in the United States, the military-industrial complex is privately owned, whereas in the Soviet Union, it's state-owned. Okay. Now, as I had mentioned, as a result of the Eisenhower Doctrine, which called for a little bit more forceful containment of the Soviet Union, a more proactive, we see a number of interventions, and we'll start with the Middle East. I'll break them down by region. And the first of them is in the Middle East. In 1953, in a move that only recently, about 5 years ago, the Central Intelligence Agency admitted to. The Central Intelligence Agency and British intelligence orchestrated the essentially what was a coup of the democratically elected prime minister. He wasn't, democratically elected is to put it one way. He was appointed by the Shah in 51 and then approved by the Iranian parliament. And the controversy was over the nationalization of oil interests. Mossadegh favored the nationalization of Iranian oil interests and a renegotiation of terms with the Western powers and their oil companies. The United States saw this as contrary. It's also true that Mossadegh's main supporters were members of the Tudeh Party, and the Tudeh Party in Iran was thought to be a socialist communist party. And so in a series of moves beginning in about April of 53, the Central Intelligence Agency orchestrated the overthrow of the Mossadegh government. He was arrested, he was imprisoned for 3 years, and then released into house arrest, where he lived the rest of his natural life until 1967. In addition, we have, as I had mentioned in a previous slide, Iraq undergoes, when we were discussing the Baghdad Pact, Iraq undergoes a revolution led by the free officers, who ultimately will give way in '63 to the Ba'athist Party, which itself evolves and gets overthrown by the United States after the 2003 invasion. But at any rate, so as a result of the Iraqi coup, which takes place in July of '54, the Eisenhower administration becomes convinced that the Iraqi free officers are generally socialist in nature and therefore will be sympathetic towards the Soviet Union, and therefore there is a fear of the spread of Soviet influence in the Middle East, which is vital to U.S. interests. And so, as the region begins to destabilize, there is a destabilization in Lebanon, and Eisenhower will dispatch U.S. Marines to stabilize the situation and to indicate, to send a signal to the Soviets that the United States is prepared to use military force to prevent any attempts by the Soviet Union to gain influence in the Middle East. And this is amplified by the fact that we'll get to in the next slide, is that in 1956, Egypt signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union in order to get the Soviet Union to finance the building of the Aswan High Dam in the southern part of the Nile, in the Upper Nile in Egypt. And so this put Egypt more into the Soviet sphere. And so the United States was at this point concerned that Iraq, Egypt, that there would be this domino effect. We'll talk about that when we deal with the Vietnam conflict, this idea that there was a dominant effect, that once one nation falls to Soviet influence, it will destabilize all of the nations around it in the region, and one by one they'll fall like dominoes. As for the Suez Crisis, just a little bit of background. In 1952, the Free Officers movement in Egypt will overthrow the British-installed government of King Farouk in a bloodless coup, actually. And immediately, within a couple of years, kind of rising to first among equals, will be Gamal Abdel Nasser, who will then lead Egyptian politics as the president until 1970, when he's replaced by Anwar Sadat. And Nasser originally comes to the United States for economic assistance, but the United States believes that Nasser is a populist and a socialist, and therefore sympathetic to the Soviet Union. It's not entirely true that he was, okay? Nasser will himself ultimately join the non-aligned movement, along with Nehru in India and Sukarno in Indonesia. But because of really the Eisenhower administration's refusal to give any assistance to Nasser, Nasser really has no choice but to turn to the Soviet Union. He'll turn to the Soviet Union with that treaty, what I mentioned in the last slide, the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation in 1956. And this kind of emboldens Nasser now that he knows that he has the Soviets as an ally. Now, that's the one thing. And partly because he's emboldened, Nasser, as the first post-World War II populist Arab leader, wants to portray himself as the leader of the Arab world. And he wants to portray himself more significantly as the leader of the Pan-Arab movement. Okay? The perception of the Pan-Arab movement, without degenerating too much into a tangent on it, is that the division of the Arab peoples is an artifice of colonialism. And so the Arab peoples themselves actually represent one nation, which is an extension of the idea of Islam representing one nation. And so Nasser will actually form a unified republic with Syria, a very short-lived one, in 1958, called the United Arab Republic. It doesn't last long. But at any rate, as a result of his desire to be the leader of the movement, he will adopt the cause and the crisis of the Palestinian refugees. Now, without, again, getting into too much of a course in Middle East history, in May of, beginning in just a little bit of background, beginning really in the 1920s, there is an influx of European Jews, okay, of the Ashkenazi Jews, into Palestine, which they've been promised as a homeland. Eventually, in 1933, the indigenous Palestinian population will begin the first Intifada, and they begin it with a general strike. Violence is associated with it on both sides, etc., etc. The situation becomes progressively tense through the 30s and into the 40s, and in 48, Israel launches what they refer to as Plan Dalet, and proclaims their independence in May of 1948. Now, Plan Dalet is a strategic military doctrine, and you can Google it. You can look it up online. It's available online. The actual original documentation is available online, in which they stipulate that in order to protect a vital civilian areas, it is necessary for the military to control the surrounding areas, which pushes any potential hostile forces out of range of the civilian population. Now, what that necessarily means, and it's stipulated in Plan Dalet, is that they're going to have to take some territory that is dominated by the Palestinian population. In 1947, the United Nations, which was the inheritor of the League of Nations mandate over Palestine, decides to divide Palestine between the Jewish population and the Palestinian population. And as a result of Plan Dalet and the desire by Israel to protect the civilian areas that were granted to it, it will launch a preemptive strike against the Arabs when they proclaim their independence. This will create the Palestinian refugee problem, and it's a little bit incorrect to hold Israel responsible entirely for it. The fact of the matter is that neither the Palestinian population nor the Jewish population in Palestine recognized the United Nations authority to divide Palestine, and neither of them recognized the borders. So a conflict was inevitable. Well, the result of this conflict was a Palestinian refugee crisis. The Palestinians had been booted out of about 2/3 of the territory that had been designated for it by the United Nations, which created a refugee problem. Nasser decides to press this issue, and he'll do two things. He'll undertake two actions. First, in an attempt to give himself some leverage over the British and French, he'll nationalize the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was built in the 1850s by the British and is a British possession, and is vital to the support of both Britain and France for their overseas colonies. Okay. And in addition, he'll use the Egyptian Navy to blockade the port of Aqaba. Aqaba is on the Red Sea. It's the Red Sea port. The Gulf of Aqaba is an offshoot of the Red Sea in the north, and it is the main Israeli port to the Red Sea. And in fact, it's the primary Israeli port for the importation of petroleum. So it effectively cuts off petroleum supplies to Israel. This gives Israel, France, and Britain a coincidence of interest against Egypt. Britain and France, for their part, to reverse the nationalization of the Suez Canal. Israel to reverse the blockade of Aqaba. And so Britain, Israel, and France will team up and launch a military operation against Egypt in the interest of lifting the blockade on Aqaba and reversing the nationalization of the Suez Canal. The Eisenhower administration, now to what the United States did, that's an awful lot of background for actually what ends up being a relatively simple explanation. But nonetheless, that's what happens when you have a brain that is just so packed full of information. Is you pull one thread of that information and it just comes spilling out all over the place. And that's kind of what that was. But at any rate, the Eisenhower administration, now it's important to remember that at this point in time, the United States is not aligned with Israel. That won't happen until the Nixon administration and the enunciation of the Nixon Doctrine in the early 1970s. The Eisenhower administration takes a more neutral position and mediates the conflict, okay, and enters into a negotiated settlement with the four principal players, Egypt, Britain, France, and Israel, and will negotiate a peace treaty. Okay, the peace treaty, without getting into the lengthy stipulations, as we would in a course on perhaps U.S. foreign policy or Middle East history, is for the lifting of the blockade of Aqaba, and Egypt will be given possession of the Suez Canal, but there will be certain stipulations with this, among them that they, over time, and with loan guarantees from the United States and Great Britain, pay the British a fair market value for the Suez Canal, and will agree not to attempt to close the canal because it is vital to international interests and international security. Okay? Now that's Eisenhower's administrations in the Middle East. Okay, now in Asia, let's just again just a brief amount of background to kind of serve as some context for Eisenhower's administrations in Asia. First, we have an ongoing dispute between the People's Republic of China on the mainland and the island of Taiwan, and it goes back. If we go back really into the 1920s, really beginning more with the Japanese occupation in 32 and 33 of China, a civil war erupts between the Communist Party of China, led by Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and the Kuomintang, which is the Nationalist Party. Okay, well, that civil war will continue after the Japanese withdrawal. The Kuomintang loses the civil war and is forced onto the island of Taiwan. Okay, where they remain today the dominant political force on Taiwan. They're the dominant political force in Taiwanese politics. Well, Quemoy and Matsu are two islands owned by Taiwan. China considers them part of their People's Republic of China considers it part of mainland China and threatens military action to reintegrate them into the Chinese mainland. The Eisenhower administration, which at this point again has no formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, will nonetheless send a very strong signal to the People's Republic that the United States will defend and fulfill its obligations based on the Taiwanese U.S. Defensive Military Alliance. If you recall, the cordon sanitaire that we looked at, that created this kind of quasi fence line around the Soviet Union and around communist influence as part of the containment regime. Well, part of that in Asia was a bilateral alliance between the United States and Taiwan, and so the United States makes a very clear signal that it's going to honor its commitment to Taiwan by moving the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Straits, which is the body of water that lies between mainland China and Taiwan. This is a distinct episode of deterrence to deter the Chinese from any kind of military operations to take Quemoy and Matsu. And historically speaking, it's a little bit of a gray area whether or not the Chinese actually intended on taking the islands or whether or not they just intended on saber rattling a little bit and threatening the Taiwanese over it. At any rate, they never did take the islands. And then, of course, we have Vietnam. I mentioned it briefly in Lecture 3.1. We'll discuss it in great detail in 3.3 when we discuss the 1960s. But after the defeat of the French Foreign Legion in Dien Bien Phu by the Viet Minh in 1954, a negotiated peace is concluded with Vietnam in Southeast Asia, which causes the French to withdraw from Indochina, and Vietnam will be divided in half. The South Vietnamese government will be non-state socialist, and they ultimately will fall into the U.S. sphere of influence, and the United States will inherit the French position there, as well as really in Cambodia and Laos as well. And North Vietnam will, of course, come under the domination of the Vietnamese Communist Party and become a populist movement and fall ultimately into the Soviet sphere of influence. Okay, it'll become very much like the Koreas. Eisenhower, in response to this, will create what he refers to as the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MECV, and the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which we talked about previously, SEATO. And this will begin the beginning of U.S. military involvement in Vietnam in 1954. And again, the Eisenhower administration's intervention is very reserved. He sends some advisors, he sends some trainers, he sends in some special forces, but not nearly the degree of force that the Johnson administration will put in there after the Tonkin Gulf resolution. But that's the beginning of the intervention in Vietnam. In the Americas, we've talked about this at great length when we had the discussion of the development of the U.S. empire, the American empire. We talked about the vast array, particularly in the early 20th century, of interventions in the Caribbean area, okay, and in Central America. Well, one of those was in Guatemala, and U.S. history with Guatemala goes back a considerable ways, okay, and we talked about it before in this class that it really took on momentum under the Theodore Roosevelt administration, uh, with the influx of U.S. business interests into Central America, the dominant of them being the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company comes to own virtually all of the land in Guatemala. The United States comes to dominate Guatemala's political environment. Okay, and so the leadership in Guatemala is backed, financed, and was installed by the United States. Well, with assistance from the Soviet Union, a populist insurgency rises up against the pro-U.S. government in Guatemala. And the Central Intelligence Agency, and this becomes a recurring theme for the Eisenhower administration. The Central Intelligence Agency will send in a wet squad and orchestrate the assassination of Guzman. A wet squad is a squad of assassins, okay, and orchestrate the assassination of Guzman, who is the populist leader. The United States will then install a new pro-U.S. government, which won't actually be toppled until the 1980s. There will be a populist insurgency in the late 70s rise up against them around the same time that the Sandinistas take over in Nicaragua, and that there's a populist uprising against the pro-U.S. government that was installed by the United States in Honduras. Okay, and we'll deal with that when we get to that period, the 1980s, and the reversals of American fortunes in Central America during that time. Now, in addition to that, we have what ultimately will be the Cuban Revolution. Okay, again, we need a little bit of background here. We talked about it already. We already kind of have the background to it. This is pursuant to the Platt Amendment on the Spanish-American War. The United States launches in pursuit of the treaty of the Spanish-American War. The United States will launch the Platt Amendment, which gives the United States virtual control over Cuba. They will install a pro-U.S. government there, but under Batista. Okay, well, an insurgency rises up in the late 40s and early 50s against Batista. It takes on speed and momentum, and by the late 50s, it's a full-scale civil war led by Fidel Castro. Okay, well, on January 1, 1959, Batista will be forced from power. Castro will take over. This is a reversal of fortunes for the United States, probably the most serious reversal of fortunes for the United States and for the Eisenhower administration. And what we're going to see when we get to the 1960s, I don't include it here, the Eisenhower administration is going to be the one that designs the Bay of Pigs operation. What the Eisenhower administration begins to design, it won't come to pass until after Eisenhower has left office, and Kennedy will give the green light on it. But what comes to pass, what the Eisenhower administration believes is that the Castro government is a small, not particularly popular government of socialist leaderships, and so he figures that if they can get some of the Cuban refugees that were pro-Batista to essentially reinvade Cuba, we can launch a counter-revolution and overthrow Castro. It will be a disastrous operation. We'll deal with it when we deal with the Kennedy administration, but it's a disastrous military operation. Because, among other things, Kennedy will withdraw CIA support for it literally on the eve of the Bay of Pigs operation. But at any rate, this is a serious reversal for the United States, because this puts a socialist government 90 miles from the United States. This government will very rapidly fall under Soviet influence. So they and the Soviets will sign a treaty of friendship and cooperation, and this ultimately will lead us to the Cuban Missile Crisis, etc., things that we'll talk about in the 1960s. On to Europe. Now, Europe is probably the most stable of them. We talked about the Berlin crisis, which was under the Truman administration. What descends in Europe is really pursuant to the Yalta Conference. It will ultimately be formalized in the 1970s in the Helsinki Accords, but it drops into spheres of influence. Okay, Eastern Europe becomes Soviet satellites. Western Europe becomes part of the NATO alliance, and so it creates a kind of a status quo. And there are a couple of challenges. One of them in the 1950s. In 1956, um, an anti-communist there will be an anti-communist agitation in Hungary that leads to a series of demonstrations and strikes and threatens to escalate out of control. The Soviet Union moves in with armored divisions and crushes the nascent rebellion. Okay, crushes the demonstrations, and the United States sits by and does nothing. And this is recognition that Hungary is in the Soviet sphere of influence. In a more significant instance, we have the U-2 spy plane incident. Now, this is before the day of satellites. This is before all of the observation satellites that they had by the end of the Cold War, okay? So to keep an eye on the Soviets, and particularly to keep an eye on the development of the Soviet Union's strategic arsenal, meaning nuclear weapons, the United States would fly something called a U-2 spy plane. A U-2 spy plane is a high altitude, 80,000 feet or more, aircraft, reconnaissance aircraft, that takes photographs. Okay, and they'd been doing this for years. Well, in 1960, just before the Eisenhower administration will leave office, a U-2 spy plane is shot down by the Soviets. Okay, piloted by Francis Gary Powers. Now I know we have to ask ourselves. I always ask myself this: if I were ever in a situation, okay, where I was captured by the enemy, right? Would I talk? And they tried to interrogate me, would I tell secrets? Would I talk? Well, in the case of Francis Gary Powers, they couldn't shut him up. He couldn't stop talking. He gave them all of the information that the United States had ever gathered, as much as he knew. Okay? And so the Soviets now understood that the United States had been spying on them, okay? Violating Soviet airspace, which is a violation of international law, and were well aware of all Soviet strategic capabilities, meaning nuclear weapons, which means that the United States understood that the United States had a decisive, okay, advantage in nuclear weapons. This is ultimately what's going to lead the Soviets to make a rather drastic and somewhat foolhardy move to try to place missiles in Cuba to counterbalance that. But we'll deal with that when we get to the 1960s at some length. And so, yeah, at that point it becomes exposed. And so tensions are rising. What you want to get the idea of, the trend that we want to think about through the Eisenhower administration, through all these interventions, is that throughout the 1950s, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War are rising to a crescendo. They will ultimately reach that crescendo in 1963, in 1962 rather, in October of 62 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, and then they'll fall off a bit, and then it will kind of fluctuate. We'll have rising tensions, falling tensions, but during the 1950s, we don't have any period of easing tensions. The tensions just continually rise from the Korean conflict onwards. And then part of that is as a result of the Eisenhower Doctrine and this continuous, as we've just seen, this continuous series of interventions. Now, obviously, hindsight's 2020, and Monday morning quarterbacking is easy. Okay, to question whether or not Eisenhower, by implementing his doctrine, created the condition that his doctrine was intended to prevent. Okay, which is to say the spread of Soviet influence. But certainly the continual military interventions by the Eisenhower administration certainly did nothing to ease tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The first president that's actually going to take deliberate actions to try to ease tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets is going to be Nixon when he launches détente. We'll deal with that in the 1970s. On to Eisenhower's economic program. Eisenhower is going to borrow the page from Truman. Now, he's going to do it a little bit more reservedly, but again, as I mentioned in the introductory lecture, and as I mentioned in the discussion of the post-war environment in the United States in lecture 3.1, we have here an application of Keynesian economics for something that Keynes himself didn't envision. Eisenhower is going to do the same thing Truman did. He's going to try to prevent the U.S. economy from falling into a recession by maintaining government-sponsored stimulation of the economy, okay, with low tax rates, particularly corporate taxes, and government spending, okay? And so what we're going to see is investment and development, a rapid increase of public housing. He's going to coordinate actions with the Federal Reserve to create a loose monetary policy through the 1950s that allow a stable business environment with low interest loans. This will stimulate growth. And perhaps most importantly, as I think I mentioned in the introductory video, the legacy really, we've all experienced the legacy of the Eisenhower administration because among his many infrastructure development projects, the most famous of them and probably the most significant of them is the development of the interstate system. With the Federal Highway Act in 1956, Eisenhower will replace the old U.S. highway system with interstates, okay? And that's what creates, if you're ever driving along the interstate, we've all driven along the interstate, if you're ever driving along the interstate and you see a little sign over on the side with 5 stars, it'll say the Eisenhower interstate system. Eisenhower's the one that built it. Okay, and this is what I was just talking about, is what we have here then with Eisenhower is a revisitation or a reapplication of Keynesian economics in the sense that he's trying to prevent the recession, and he's successful. He does it successfully. Okay, he'll have an average growth rate until 1964. Okay, we'll have an average growth of 3.2%. Okay, there will be minor dips into very brief recessions, but for the most part, and that's why the 1950s is known as a time of great prosperity, great growth. But I want you to remember, okay, that the 1920s was also considered a period of prosperity and growth. Okay, so we have very similar conditions here. Very similar conditions in the 1920s. What did we have in the 1920s? We had the Red Scare. We had a Republican-dominated government. Okay, well, we have kind of the same thing in the 50s. Okay, we had in the 20s, we had this period of apparent prosperity. We're going to have that again in the 1950s. Okay, now when we get to the Johnson administration in the 1960s, Johnson is going to continue this idea of stimulating the economy through increased spending. Okay, he's going to be spending on both the Vietnam conflict and what he refers to, what we'll come to call the Great Society, etc. Okay, we're going to see this again in the 70s and into the 80s and into the 90s. Clinton administration is going to pull back from it a little bit. But again, this is a recurring theme, this use of Keynesianism in an attempt to prevent the economy from entering into a recession. It ultimately is going to be one of the main precipitory causes of the banking crisis in 2008, which Greenspan actually will recognize, but we'll deal with that when we get there. Now, on to American culture. The 1950s American culture is probably the most famous, and what we have for the first time in American history in the 1950s, and it's because of the advent of television. Okay, television is developed in the late 1940s, and by the 1950s, it really has come online. It's still really only the more well-to-do families that have televisions in the 1950s. By the 1960s, it will be fairly commonplace as the price of TVs drops. But what you have as a result of this and the radio, and you will have the capacity now to shape the American image like you've never done it before. You now have the availability of mass media. And so what we will see on the part of the United States. And it's not really on the part of the United States government. It's more of a social phenomenon. It's more of a kind of a group consciousness that develops in the United States to shape the ideal American image. Okay, and so what we have is we have things like Father Knows Best, I Love Lucy, The Honeymooners, Ozzie and Harriet, where you have, Leave It to Beaver, where you have the perfect nuclear American family, mother and father who are not divorced, who are married, 2 to 3 children, stable environments. They have their little, house in the suburbs. And so that becomes the American ideal that they want everyone to live up to. The other thing that we see in the 50s, which is kind of interesting and which isn't often talked about, is we have also rising up through this time shows like The Lone Ranger and The Rifleman and things like Gunsmoke, which actually will be mostly through the 60s. But the idea is that with mass media, not only can you shape a public image, you can also reshape a public image. You can also kind of reinvent, if you will, what something was like historically. And so what we get in the 1950s beginning is a reinvention of what the American West was like. We talked a little bit about it in the late 19th century. The American West in the late 19th century was very close to an anarchic condition. Okay, you had the virtual genocide of the Native Americans. You had large-scale organized violence perpetrated by these mercenary bands who were hired by the cattle corporations and the mining corporations. Well, in the characterization of the Old West, they romanticize the Old West. Okay, and we'll see that, and that will stay until really the modern times, until even into the 1970s and 80s. One of the more interesting films that will kind of start to strip that away is one of my probably my favorite Western of all time, which stars and was directed by Clint Eastwood, called Unforgiven, where Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman are teamed up. That really is a little bit more accurate characterization of what the Old West was like. But at any rate, and so all of this depicts an American ideal that gives Americans something to live up to, something to strive for, okay, something to spend their money to create for themselves. So it is going to be integral, okay, to the continuation of economic prosperity and growth. According to the Keynesian model that's being applied here, what's necessary to maintain growth is continued demand. Okay? And so you need to continue demand. By creating this ideal, you give people an incentive to work, earn money, and buy things so that they can fit that ideal. Okay? In addition, with the advent of television, of course, you're going to have the mushrooming of commercials and advertising. And so, more than it ever has, in the 1950s, the United States is going to turn into a consumerist society. We talked about it, oddly enough, where I keep referring back to the 1920s. Okay, in the 1920s, we had the development of American consumerism. We had the first incidents of the expansion of the lines of credit, okay, of buying on layaway, of going into debt, okay, of borrowing money to buy consumer goods. Okay, we're going to have that amplified and to a large magnitude in the 1950s. And so that's going to be what the 1950s is about. The other thing, and I made mention of it in the introductory video, which is unfortunate for the Eisenhower administration, is the Eisenhower administration is never really credited for its movement towards civil rights. The Civil Rights Act will be passed in 1964 under the Johnson administration, and so largely the 1960s is thought of as the time of civil rights. And that's correctly so. The 60s was a time of civil rights. But the preconditions for the civil rights movement were laid in the 1950s. Okay, most significantly, a Supreme Court case. Okay, there was an earlier case called Plessy v. Ferguson, and Plessy v. Ferguson established that it was okay to have what was referred to as separate but equal facilities. Okay? In other words, the black population could be segregated from the white population so long as the black population had equal facilities, which of course they didn't. They were never given equal facilities. Okay? Uh, in a landmark decision in 54, the Supreme Court will hear the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, in which they reversed Plessy v. Ferguson on the basis of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that all U.S. citizens are to be treated equally under the law, regardless of essentially race, creed, or color, or condition of prior servitude. This came right after the Civil War. We talked about it way back in Epoch 1, which seems like, months ago. Actually, it was months ago. It was 2 months ago. But at any rate, way back in Epoch 1, okay, we talked about this. So Plessy v. Ferguson was seen as a violation of the 14th Amendment. Okay, as a result of this, this meant that at least on a legal constitutional basis, you couldn't segregate white and black populations. Well, of course, passing such a ruling and enforcing such a ruling are two entirely different things. What this ruling meant was that black school children would suddenly start going to all white public education facilities, all white schools. And so we have a showdown in Little Rock in 1957, in which, in one of the rare occurrences, Eisenhower will actually call out the 82nd Airborne Division. He'll call out the National Army to enforce the decision in Brown versus the Board of Education and escort black children to an all-white school. And so Eisenhower really is given short shrift in terms of his enforcement of civil rights. But this was a landmark case. Now, in addition, we have this rise of the counterculture, and this counterculture that begins really in the mid to late 50s will give rise to the counterculture that becomes its own dominant culture in the 1960s. Okay, so this is the 1950s is referred to as the Beat Generation, and you see, this is when you have Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and Sloan Wilson and all these kind of radical beatnik questioning authority. The 60s is what usually gets credited for that movement. No, the foundation for it is laid in the 50s. Okay, where you have this generation, and it will be characterized in films such as Rebel Without a Cause with it's not coming to mind right away, but at any rate, it might come to me before I'm all said and done here. But among other things, you have the advent of rock and roll music. Okay, Elvis Presley and what Elvis Presley does. People always think of Elvis as the king of rock and roll. I'm not so sure I go that far, because Elvis Presley in his entire career wrote one and only one song. I just think that you can't be the king of rock and roll if you're not also writing your music. But someone like Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly wrote his own music, arranged his own. He was the first to write, arrange, and perform his own music. He was also the first to wear glasses on stage when he performed. Okay. And so this created a counterculture. And so what you're doing is, while the establishment in culture, while the establishment is busily trying to shape an ideal image of the American establishment, you have an antithesis rising up against this in this counterculture, in this beatnik generation counterculture, which will come to its full fruition in the 1960s. Now, the legacy of Eisenhower. What do we have? Well, Eisenhower will lay the groundwork for a number of things. He'll lay the basis for the escalation in the Vietnam conflict with the establishment of the Military Assistance Command in Vietnam. This will mushroom and escalate under the Johnson administration and not be drawn down till Nixon in the 1970s. Okay, it establishes, as I've just said, the basis for the counterculture that rises in the 1960s, for the more radical elements of the civil rights movement, led by people like Hobie Carmichael and Malcolm X, and the Black Power movement, as well as you'll have this anti-war movement that rises up in the 60s. He establishes, again, the basis for the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And so Martin Luther King, the March in Selma, all these different things are all the basis of it is all going to be laid. The groundwork is going to be laid in the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration. And then finally, what we're going to see with the Eisenhower administration is a reinvention of the Republican Party. Remember, the Republican Party of the 1920s and earlier called for laissez-faire economics, no government involvement, right? Well, the Eisenhower administration is going to say that. Now, the Republican administration is still going to stand for what the Republican Party used to stand for, which is to say conservative cultural values. This is why we see kind of the shaping of the Republican ideal the way we do in the 1950s. Okay? But under Eisenhower, the Republican Party is going to change its economic position, particularly because of the advent of Franklin Roosevelt. It's going to now become a standard practice for government to become involved in the economy, to take an active role in the economy. It would just be a question of how much of an active role, rather than the philosophical question of whether or not the government should have a role. Okay? It used to be, back in the 20s and earlier, that it was a question of whether or not the government should play any part in the economy at all. Well, Eisenhower is going to reinvent the Republican Party to some degree, and now it's no longer a question of whether or not the government should do that, but how much it should do that. Okay? And so that concludes the discussion of the 1950s. In the next lecture, we'll discuss the very turbulent decade of the 1960s.